Welcome to the story of John Brown, the man who sparked a revolution. This is not a simple story, but one that has many twists and turns. I invite you to join me as we travel back to a time when freedom was fought for in blood and bravery. Today, we will explore the life of a man who dared to stand up for what he believed in. As you listen to this story, think about the many times in history when a single act of defiance changed everything. Now, I ask you, where are you watching from? Are you joining us from the comfort of your home, or are you somewhere far away where these echoes of the past still live on? Let your voice be heard in the comments and share your place in this journey. I encourage you to subscribe to our channel, follow us for more stories of change, and leave a like if you believe in the power of one person to make a difference. Get ready, because the legend of John Brown is about to unfold in front of you, and it may challenge everything you think you know about freedom and revolution. Always. The first light of dawn would gently wake the small town in rural Ohio, where a young boy named John Brown began his life among quiet fields and humble homes. In a modest farmhouse built by hard-working hands, John was born into a family that lived close to the land. His father, Owen Brown, was a stern man with kind eyes, who taught his children that every human life was precious. His mother, a gentle soul with a soft voice, filled their small home with warm stories and a deep sense of hope. Though life was simple and hard work was the order of the day, the values of love and fairness were passed down from one generation to the next. From an early age, John was different from the other children in his small community. While most kids played and laughed in the open fields, John often sat quietly, watching the sun rise over the golden crops. He would listen to the birds and feel the cool wind, and in those moments he wondered about the world beyond his small town. Even as a child, he felt a stirring inside his heart, a feeling that the world could be better if people were treated fairly. His parents, although strict, encouraged him to be honest and just, and they often spoke about the importance of standing up for what is right. One hot summer day, when John was barely 10 years old, he witnessed a scene that would change him forever. As he walked with his father along a dusty road, they passed a small group of men gathered near a field. There, John saw a young boy who was not like him. The boy was tied to a post, and his small body trembled under the lash of a whip. The sound of the whip cracking through the air and the cries of the boy struck John deeply. He could not understand how a man could hurt another human being in such a cruel way. His innocent eyes filled with tears, and even at that young age, John felt that something was terribly wrong with the way some people were treated. In the days that followed, John asked many questions. "Why did they hurt him?" he would whisper to his father. Owen Brown, though saddened by what he had seen, explained in simple words that not everyone in the world followed the same rules. Some people believed that one person could own another, and that the strong could do as they pleased with the weak. These words confused young John. He could not imagine a world where people were allowed to harm others just because of the color of their skin or the luck of their birth. This moment left a mark on his heart and set him on a journey that would grow as he grew older. As the seasons passed, John's days were filled with the work of the farm. He helped in the fields from the early morning until the sun dipped below the horizon. Yet even as he labored alongside his father, his mind wandered to the ideas of fairness and justice that he could not forget. The simple life on the farm was a mix of hard work and small moments of beauty, a quiet sunrise, the sound of the wind in the trees, and the smile of a neighbor passing by. But interwoven with these pleasant moments were the lessons of sorrow and the silent witness of injustice. At school, held in a one-room building at the edge of the town, John learned to read and write with care. His teacher, a patient man with a kind heart, read stories of brave heroes and of lands where every person was free. John listened intently to these tales, and he began to imagine a world that was very different from the one he knew. The simple stories, full of honest words and clear morals, planted a seed in his heart, a seed that one day he would work to help those who were suffering. Even in the quiet hours after the day's work, John's mind was busy. At night, by the light of a small oil lamp, he would sit with his father and ask about the news from other towns. They spoke of strange events in faraway places, and of men and women who dared to stand up for their beliefs. Although the language was plain, the message was clear. The world was full of injustice, and there were those brave enough to fight against it. John listened, absorbing every word, and felt that his own future was intertwined with these stories of courage. As John entered his teenage years, he began to see the world in a new light. He watched with a heavy heart as the small town he had known for so long became a place where whispers of cruelty and fear crept in. He often walked along the narrow country roads, thinking about the young slave boy he had seen that fateful day. In these quiet moments, the beauty of the land was contrasted sharply by the harshness of human cruelty. He realized that while nature gave freely and equally, people often did not. The lessons of his childhood, the quiet sermons of his father, the gentle stories of his mother, and the painful memory of that brutal summer day slowly molded him into a man with a strong sense of right and wrong. He began to understand that to change the world, one must first understand it deeply. He talked to the elders of the town, listened to the stories of old, and read every book he could find that told of past heroes and the struggles they faced. Each story, whether of victory or sorrow, added another thread to the tapestry of his growing conviction. John's early life was marked by the simple rhythms of farm work and the steady passing of the seasons. Yet every day, his heart grew heavier with the knowledge that not all people were treated as equals. The fields, once a symbol of the beauty of nature, became a constant reminder of the injustice that lay hidden in plain sight. When he saw how hard the farmers worked and how little they received for their labor, he thought about the many lives that were oppressed by a system built on cruelty and greed. It was then that his thoughts began to turn toward a larger cause, a call for change that would one day become his life's work. One spring, when the blossoms painted the fields with hope and color, John began to share his thoughts with a few trusted friends. They were simple boys and girls who, like him, had seen the sorrow in the world. In the quiet shade of an old oak tree, they would gather after school to talk about the dreams of a fair and just society. Their language was plain, and their ideas were simple: that every person should be free, that every life should be valued, and that injustice must be met with courage. These small gatherings were the beginning of a slow but powerful awakening, a gathering of hearts united by a shared desire for a better world. As the years went by, the spark in John's heart grew into a steady flame. His days of reading and quiet reflection turned into days filled with discussions about the future. In the local church, during long, slow sermons, he listened as the preacher spoke of freedom, of the need for mercy and justice, and of the promise that one day the land would be healed. Although the words were simple, they resonated deeply within him. He began to see that the fight for justice was not a distant battle fought by strangers in far-off lands, but a struggle that touched every corner of his own home. At home, life was never easy. The farm demanded long hours of hard work, and there was little time for rest. Yet every morning, as the sun climbed over the horizon, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would help his father plow the fields, tend the animals, and harvest the crops. In every task, he saw a reflection of the larger work that needed to be done, a work that would require patience, perseverance, and a steadfast belief in the dignity of every human soul. His hands grew rough and calloused from the work, but his heart remained soft with the hope of change. During his late teens, the simple life of the farm began to feel both comforting and confining. While the land offered stability, it also reminded him daily of the inequalities that plagued the world. The same sun that warmed the earth also shone on fields where men toiled without rest. In the quiet moments between work and sleep, John would gaze out over the fields and dream of a life where justice was not just a word, but a reality. He began to realize that change did not come from waiting quietly, it came from standing up and speaking out. This inner change grew stronger as he learned more about the world beyond his town. Letters from distant relatives and travelers brought news of far-off places where people struggled under cruel masters and where brave souls risked everything to fight for freedom. John read every word with wide eyes and an aching heart. These stories of suffering and hope lit a fire in him, a burning desire to do more than simply work the land. He wanted to help lift the burdens of those who were oppressed, to be a voice for the silent and the broken. One day, while walking down a dusty road between the fields, John met a traveler who had been on long journeys across many states. The traveler spoke in plain, simple language of distant lands, where men and women were locked in battles for their rights. He described towns where people were free and others where the weight of slavery crushed every hope. The traveler's words were honest and direct. John listened intently, absorbing every detail. That day, the traveler's stories became a part of him. They urged him to look beyond the safety of his home and to see the larger world, a world that needed someone to challenge its deep injustices. John's heart grew heavy with each new story of cruelty and each new lesson learned from the pain of others. His mind turned constantly to the idea of justice in the many ways in which people suffered. The face of the young slave boy, beaten under the hot sun, returned to him over and over again in quiet moments. He wondered how many lives were lost to a system that cared only for power and wealth. The clear, simple truth became undeniable. If the world was to change, it must begin with those who dared to stand up against the cruelty of the day. In his later teenage years, John began to share his thoughts more openly. In small-town meetings, in the corners of local taverns, and even during long church services, he spoke in simple words about the need for fairness. "Every life is important," he would say, his voice steady and sure. "We cannot stand by and let others suffer while we keep silent." His words were not grand or full of fancy language, but they carried the strength of his belief. Slowly, some people began to listen. A few nodded, a few whispered their agreement, and a handful even dared to share their own dreams of a fairer life. John's family saw the change in him too. His father sometimes worried when he saw the look in his son's eyes, a look that was both thoughtful and fierce. Yet Owen Brown also felt a quiet pride. He had taught his son to value truth and justice, and now he saw that those lessons were growing into a force that could change lives. His mother, always gentle and kind, would often place her hand on his shoulder and whisper words of encouragement. "Remember, my son," she would say, "that every great change begins with a single step taken by a brave heart." These words stayed with John, reminding him that the path he had chosen was hard but right. The community around him was slowly waking up too. Neighbors who had once accepted the slow pace of life began to murmur about the need for change. At the local market, small conversations about fairness and the pain of oppression started to mix with the everyday talk of crops and weather. Though most people were cautious and afraid of stirring trouble, John's simple and honest words planted a seed of hope in many hearts. By the time John reached his early 20s, his mind and spirit were set on a single clear purpose. The gentle rhythms of farm life had given way to a deep, burning need to right the wrongs he saw around him. He began to travel a little further from home, meeting others who shared his vision. In nearby towns, he listened to the stories of those who had suffered under the cruel systems of their time. Each story, told in plain and direct language, added another layer to his understanding. The more he learned, the more he felt that action was needed. It was not enough to feel sorrow. One must act to bring light into a dark world. In the quiet moments of early mornings and the soft glow of evening, John would often sit by a small stream near his family's farm. The sound of the flowing water and the rustle of leaves in the gentle wind gave him time to think. He thought of the slave boy he had seen as a child, of the many lives lost to injustice, and of the future that could be if people were treated with kindness and respect. These moments of reflection strengthened his resolve. He knew that one day he would have to leave the safety of his home to work for a larger cause. A cause that would require him to take risks and to stand up against powerful forces. Every day on the farm brought new lessons. The hard work taught him the value of persistence and the slow, steady march of time. The changing seasons reminded him that life was full of cycles, of growth and decay, of sorrow and hope, and in every face he saw in his small town, whether it was the tired eyes of an old farmer or the bright smile of a child, John saw a story of struggle and a spark of hope that he wanted to nurture. At last the day came when John could no longer keep his dreams confined to quiet conversations and small acts of kindness. The world outside was too full of pain, and the call for justice grew too strong. With a heavy heart but a determined spirit, he made the choice to devote himself fully to the fight for a better, more just society. He began to speak openly about the need to stand against cruelty, to challenge the unjust rules that kept so many in chains. His language was plain, his ideas simple. Every person deserved to be free, and every act of injustice must be met with a bold, brave response. John's journey was just beginning. The seeds of revolution that had been planted in his heart during his early years were now ready to take root and grow. In the quiet nights after long days of work, he wrote in a small journal. He described the faces he had seen, the injustices he could not ignore, and the hope that one day the world would be a place of freedom and dignity. His words were not full of fancy language or grand ideas, but they were honest and true. Each line was a promise to himself and to the many souls who had suffered under a cruel system. Thus, in the gentle days of his youth, John Brown was shaped by every small act of kindness, every harsh lesson, and every whispered dream of a better world. His journey from a curious boy on a small Ohio farm to a man filled with a burning desire for justice was slow and steady. Each day brought him closer to the understanding that great change starts with simple truths. That every life is valuable, that every human being deserves freedom, and that sometimes one must rise up and speak out when silence only brings more pain. As the sun set over the fields and the stars began to light up the sky, John Brown looked out over the land he loved. He knew that his path was set before him, a long road filled with challenges, hard work, and sacrifice. Yet his heart was strong, filled with the clear belief that even the smallest spark could one day light a fire of change that would burn away the darkness of injustice. In the soft glow of the evening, with the cool breeze whispering promises of a brighter future, John made a silent vow to himself. He would become a man who fought for those who could not fight for themselves. He would stand up against the cruelty he had seen and work to bring hope to a broken world. In that quiet moment, as the night embraced the small town of Ohio, the making of a revolutionary was complete. The simple boy who once listened to the wind had grown into a man who knew that every step toward justice was a step worth taking. And though his journey was only just beginning, the lessons of his childhood, of love, sorrow, and the relentless desire for fairness, would guide him all the days of his life. When John Brown grew into a young man, the memories of his childhood in Ohio, the soft mornings on the farm, the lessons of fairness taught by his parents, and the pain of witnessing cruelty stayed with him like a burning ember. He now knew that a quiet life would never be enough to heal the deep wounds of injustice he saw around him. With a heavy heart and a mind full of purpose, John left the familiar fields of his youth. The road ahead promised danger, and the peaceful days were now replaced by a world steeped in conflict. News had reached him of a land far away, Kansas, a place where the fight between the free and the enslaved was not fought with words alone, but with the clash of arms. In Kansas, men were ready to take up violence as a way to break the chains of oppression. The gentle boy who once wondered at the beauty of a sunrise now saw that every new day carried a cost of blood and sacrifice. John believed that if he did not act, the innocent would continue to suffer. With a deep, steady resolve, he set out on a journey to join the struggle in a new land where freedom was being won at a terrible price. The journey from Ohio to Kansas was long and hard. John traveled by foot and by wagon, passing through small towns and open plains. In each new place, he saw evidence of the same cruelty he had witnessed as a child. Stories of families torn apart, of men and women beaten down by a cruel system, and of whispered hopes that one day change would come. His heart grew heavier with every step, yet his determination only strengthened. He knew that to stand against the injustice of slavery, he must face the harshest challenges and cross the boundaries that separated peace from violent defiance. When John arrived in Kansas in the mid-1850s, he found a land in turmoil. The state was a battleground where the old ways of slavery clashed with new dreams of freedom. In Kansas, settlers were divided by fierce arguments, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with tension. Towns that once promised hope now echoed with the sounds of gunfire and angry shouts. It was a place where simple living had turned into a struggle for survival. John quickly learned that in Kansas, words were no longer enough to challenge the system. He met men and women who had given up on gentle talks and had embraced the idea that force was sometimes needed to protect the innocent. In small, secret gatherings held in basements and back rooms, people spoke plainly of the need to fight back. They shared stories of how slaves were beaten, of how families were separated, and of how the voice of justice was stifled by those in power. Every word fueled John's desire to take a stand. The tension in Kansas soon burst into open conflict. In one bitter winter night, a group of pro-slavery men gathered to intimidate free settlers and enforce the cruel rules of the old order. John and a small band of like-minded fighters could not stand by while innocent lives were threatened. In the cover of darkness, they crept through the cold streets and reached the group of men. In a swift and terrible moment, the men fought back. The violent clash that followed was fierce and full of raw anger, a moment that would later be known as the Potawatomi Massacre. The massacre was not carried out lightly. John and his companions believed that every act of cruelty had to be met with a force strong enough to break the cycle of oppression. As the night deepened, the air filled with the sounds of struggle and sorrow. Lives were lost in a flash of rage and grief. For John, the blood spilled was a painful reminder that the fight for freedom often came at a high price. The massacre spread fear among supporters of slavery and ignited a spark of hope among those who longed for justice. In the weeks that followed the violent night in Kansas, the land trembled with uncertainty. News of the massacre spread quickly among the settlers and the enslaved alike. Many saw in John Brown's actions a necessary evil, a desperate step taken in a desperate time. Others, however, regarded him as a dangerous man, too quick to use violence even when the cause was just. In the midst of this turmoil, John began to gather others who shared his vision for a freer land. At first, the meetings were small and held in secret. In a modest cabin on the edge of a small Kansas town, men and women gathered around a simple wooden table. Their language was plain and honest as they discussed the terrible state of affairs and the need to stand up against the oppression of slavery. John, now a man hardened by his experiences yet still carrying the lessons of his gentle upbringing, spoke in clear, simple words. He told them that the fight for freedom could not wait any longer, that every moment of inaction meant more suffering for those who were trapped in chains. These early gatherings were filled with a mix of fear, hope, and determination. Some members of the group had family who suffered daily under the harsh rule of pro-slavery masters. Others had lost everything to a system built on cruelty and greed. In these meetings, the group made plans to protect their people and to take bold steps that might free the oppressed. Every plan was simple and direct. No elaborate speeches or lofty promises, just a firm belief that action was needed. John's calm, steady voice became a guiding light for many. Even as the threat of retaliation loomed large, he reminded them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. His simple message resonated with all who listened. We must stand up. We must fight back. Our lives and the lives of those we love depend on it. The words, spoken plainly and with heartfelt conviction, began to bind the group together. They became a band of rebels, ordinary men and women united by extraordinary circumstances. As the group grew, so did the dangers they faced. Violence in Kansas was not confined to one single night, it spread like a wildfire across the state. Small skirmishes became more common, and every day brought new stories of loss and suffering. John Brown found himself at the center of these events, his heart heavy with the weight of every life taken and every tear shed. The simple ideals he once held were now tested by the brutal reality of armed conflict. In a small settlement, one morning John witnessed a scene that shook him to his core. A group of pro-slavery men, determined to restore order, rode into town with their guns drawn. They rounded up a group of free settlers and threatened them with violence if they did not bend to the old, cruel ways. John watched from a distance as families were forced to submit to humiliating demands. The injustice was plain and bitter, and he felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, a deep, burning need to protect the innocent. That day, the rebel band decided that silence was no longer an option. They could not stand by as the helpless were trampled under the boots of tyrants. In a planned act of defiance, John and his men moved swiftly. They intercepted a group of pro-slavery men on a lonely stretch of road. In the ensuing clash, the air filled with shouts and the crack of gunfire. The rebels fought with desperate courage, knowing that every life they risked was a stand against a system that had already claimed too many victims. The cost of each violent encounter weighed heavily on John. Though he believed that the road to freedom was paved with sacrifice, the faces of those lost haunted him long after the fighting had ended. At night, when the fires of their secret camp flickered against the dark Kansas sky, John would sit quietly and remember each fallen comrade. He would think of the young slave boy he had seen so many years before, and wonder if his own actions could ever truly bring about the change he so deeply desired. Yet even in the midst of such sorrow, the rebel band grew stronger. With each battle, they learned more about the strength of their convictions and the price of the struggle. Their simple language, filled with words like freedom, justice, and sacrifice, became a mantra that sustained them. The violent road they had chosen was dangerous and uncertain, but it was a road that promised to break the chains of a broken system, one act of defiance at a time. After months of fighting in Kansas, John Brown began to see that the local battles were only part of a larger war. The violence that had erupted in the fields and small towns was a symptom of a deep and bitter divide in the nation. He realized that if he truly wished to end the suffering caused by slavery, he must look beyond the borders of Kansas. A new vision began to take shape in his mind, a vision of a united and free country where every person, regardless of race or station, would be equal. It was during a long, cold winter that John first spoke of a bold plan. In the dim light of a modest cabin, with snow piling high against the windows, he gathered his closest followers. Their breath turned to mist as they sat huddled near a small fire. John's voice was soft but filled with a fierce resolve as he explained his idea. "We have fought hard in Kansas," he said, "but our work is not done here. There is a place where we can make a stand that will shake the very foundations of this unjust nation." He spoke of Harpers Ferry, a federal armory in Virginia, that to him symbolized the power of an oppressive government. In his plain words, John explained that if they could capture the weapons stored there, they could arm not just themselves, but also the many who suffered in silence under the yoke of slavery. The idea was both daring and dangerous, but his followers listened intently. They knew that in order to free the oppressed, a bold and decisive act was needed. Over the following weeks, secret meetings were held in hushed tones. In these gatherings, the rebel band discussed the plan in simple language, breaking down each detail. They spoke of maps, routes, and the timing of the attack. Every word was chosen carefully so that everyone understood the risks and the rewards of their endeavor. The language was plain. There was no need for flowery words when the cause was as clear as the need for freedom. "We will take those weapons," John said, "and we will show the world that the chains of oppression can be broken." As the plan for the raid on Harpers Ferry began to take shape, John's group worked hard to gather what they could. They collected funds from sympathetic souls, purchased a few extra supplies, and even managed to secure a small cache of arms to practice with. The training was basic and unadorned. In isolated barns and backyards, the men practiced handling their weapons and moving silently under cover of darkness. Each practice session was a step toward a future where violence might finally be transformed into liberation. Even as they planned for the Great Raid, the shadow of Kansas's violence still loomed large. Many in the group had lost friends or seen terrible acts of cruelty. The memory of every loss, every tear shed under the Kansas sky, only strengthened their resolve. They knew that the struggle for freedom was never easy and that the road ahead would be fraught with danger. But in those secret meetings, with the soft glow of candlelight on determined faces, they dared to dream of a new nation, built on the simple truth that every person deserved to be free. With the plan firmly in place, John Brown and his loyal followers prepared to leave Kansas behind and move toward their bold target, Harpers Ferry. The journey would be long and dangerous, and every step would take them further away from the familiar fields of Ohio and the bitter memories of Kansas. Their faces were set with grim determination as they gathered what little they had and set out on the dusty roads that led eastward. The group traveled mostly at night, moving under the cover of darkness to avoid the eyes of those who might betray them. By day, they took refuge in abandoned barns or hidden groves, resting and tending to their weary bodies. The long miles on rough, unpaved roads tested them both physically and emotionally, yet with each passing mile, the hope of a better future spurred them onward. Their simple conversations, about home, about loss, and about the promise of freedom, kept their spirits alive even in the harshest conditions. As they neared Virginia, the land began to change. The open plains of the Midwest gave way to rugged hills and thick patches of forest. The air was cooler, and the sound of distant industry whispered of a nation on the edge of transformation. John led his group with quiet determination, stopping occasionally to check their maps and ensure they were on the right path. In these moments, the words he had spoken in the small, secret meetings echoed in their hearts, that the fight for freedom was worth every risk. Along the way, the group encountered other people, some who offered quiet support, and others who eyed them with suspicion. In simple conversations held at roadside taverns or over shared meals, John explained in plain language the cause for which they fought. Many were moved by his sincerity, and a few even offered additional help or safe houses. Each kind word and small act of generosity was a reminder that the struggle was not fought in isolation. It was a shared burden carried by countless souls yearning for justice. The journey was not without its hardships. There were nights when hunger gnawed at their bellies and mornings when bitter cold seeped into their bones. Yet, as they trudged along muddy roads and climbed steep hills, their hearts beat with the belief that every sacrifice was a step closer to a world where freedom reigned. John often paused during these long marches, looking at the faces of his comrades. In their tired eyes, he saw the same fierce hope that had taken root in him so many years ago on the quiet Ohio farm. That hope was the spark that would carry them through even the darkest of times. After many weeks on the road, the group finally reached the outskirts of Virginia. They found a small, secluded spot near a gentle river where they could rest and plan their final steps in relative safety. In this quiet place, away from prying eyes and the relentless pace of their journey, John Brown gathered his most trusted followers for one last meeting. The mood was somber, and every face was etched with the marks of hardship and loss. Under the soft light of a fading day, John spoke plainly about what was to come. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice steady and clear, "we move toward Harpers Ferry. We know the risks, we know the cost, but our cause is just, and we must act now, while there is still a chance to bring about true freedom." His words were simple, yet every word carried the weight of the journey they had endured. The rebels listened in silence, each understanding that their lives were about to change forever. In the final days before the raid, the group spent every moment preparing. They reviewed their plans, went over the maps one last time, and checked every piece of equipment. Training sessions were held at dawn and dusk, ensuring that everyone knew their role and could act with speed and precision when the moment arrived. The simple routine of practice, discussion, and quiet prayer filled their days. There was little room for fear, only a deep, shared resolve that the fight for freedom must go on. During these quiet moments, John often thought back to his early years on the Ohio farm. He remembered the gentle mornings, the lessons of kindness and justice his parents had taught him, and the pain he had felt as a child when he saw cruelty inflicted on the helpless. Those memories, once soft and distant, now fueled a fierce determination. They reminded him that the cost of freedom was high, but that no life should be sacrificed to injustice. In his heart, he knew that every step he had taken, from the quiet fields of his youth to the violent roads of Kansas and now the tense paths toward Harpers Ferry, was leading him to a moment that might change history. As the day of the raid approached, a heavy tension settled over John and his followers. Every small sound, every rustle of the leaves in the wind seemed to signal that history was about to be made. The simple truth that had guided them since their early meetings now shone in stark contrast with the danger of the coming hours. In the final hours before the assault on Harpers Ferry, the rebel band gathered together, one last time to reaffirm their commitment to the cause. They spoke in hushed tones about the future, a future where the bonds of slavery would be broken and every person could live free from oppression. John's eyes, filled with both pain and fierce hope, met those of his comrades. "We have come this far because we believe that every human life matters," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Today, we stand together as brothers and sisters in the fight for freedom. No matter what happens, know that our struggle is for justice, and justice once kindled cannot be put out." His words, plain and honest, resonated deeply within each heart. They knew that the moment was at hand, a moment that might bring either triumph or tragedy. Yet in that simple affirmation of belief, there was a bond that held them fast together. The night before the planned raid was long and filled with restless dreams. In the silence of the camp, the only sounds were the soft murmur of the river and the quiet prayers of those who hoped for a new dawn. Each rebel carried with him the memories of lost friends and the unyielding desire for a future free of chains. Even as the fear of what was to come pressed in from all sides, the simple language of hope and courage provided a steady light. They believed that if they acted with a united spirit, their cause could ignite a fire that would change the nation forever. As the first light of dawn broke over Virginia, a heavy hush fell over the small camp near Harpers Ferry. John Brown and his followers had spent long days and many nights planning and preparing for this very moment. In the quiet hours before sunrise, every face was set with a mix of fear and determination. They knew that the raid they were about to launch could change their lives forever. At last, the time came. Under the cover of the early morning darkness, the band moved quietly from their hiding place toward the Federal Armory at Harpers Ferry. The armory was a large, sturdy building that held weapons and ammunition, tools of an oppressive government that many believed kept the poor and enslaved in chains. John Brown believed that by seizing these arms, his people could arm themselves and spark a rebellion that would sweep across the nation. The group approached the armory slowly and cautiously. Every step was measured, and every sound was held in check. The simple orders were given in quiet voices. Move quietly, watch your step, stay close. There was no room for error. For years, the rebels had planned each detail in secret meetings, and now every detail was coming into play. At the break of dawn, with the light barely spilling over the horizon, John Brown led his men to the door of the armory. The air was cool and still. In that tense moment, the rebel band burst into action. They kicked open the door and rushed inside, taking the guards by surprise. In the chaos that followed, the sound of shouted orders, the clatter of falling equipment, and the echo of determined footsteps filled the building. John Brown moved with purpose. His simple, firm voice gave orders as he and his men quickly gathered as many weapons as they could. They did not waste time on elaborate strategies now. Every second counted. The idea was clear: seize the arms, arm the people, and spark the fire of rebellion. For a brief, heart-pounding moment, it seemed that the rebels might succeed. But the raid did not go entirely as planned. Within minutes, word of the attack spread quickly. Soldiers from nearby forts and local militia began to arrive on the scene. The noise of hooves on the road, the crack of rifles, and the shouts of reinforcements filled the air. What began as a swift, daring strike turned into a fierce, chaotic battle. In the midst of the struggle, John Brown stood at the center of the storm. He fought with a calm fierceness, urging his men to hold their ground. "Remember why we are here," he cried, in his plain, direct way. The rebels fought with passion, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by the well-organized soldiers who now surrounded the armory. Gunfire echoed down the narrow streets, and smoke filled the air as the battle raged outside the walls of Harpers Ferry. The chaos spread quickly as reinforcements closed in from all sides. In the confusion, some of the rebels managed to break away from the main group, disappearing into the nearby woods. Others fell in the fierce fighting. Amid the turmoil, John Brown was soon overwhelmed by the force of the government troop. Chapter 2: The Fall of the Rebel Band. As the battle continued, it became clear that the raid was falling apart. The soldiers, led by experienced officers, began to surround the building, cutting off any chance of escape. The small band of rebels found themselves trapped in a place that had once been their beacon of hope. Inside the armory, the fight turned desperate. John Brown's men fought bravely, but the overwhelming number of soldiers pressed in from every side. The simple hope of sparking a widespread rebellion was now met with a harsh, brutal reality. Many of the rebels were injured, and some were captured. The sound of the battle was replaced by a heavy silence as more and more of Brown's followers surrendered or fell in combat. John Brown himself fought on until it was clear that there was no way to win. Surrounded by enemy soldiers and with his comrades either captured or injured, he refused to flee. His eyes held a calm determination as he realized that his cause had become larger than his own survival. In that final stand, John Brown gave one last command to his remaining followers: "Let our act show the truth of our hearts. We fight for freedom, even if it costs us everything." In the midst of the melee, soldiers managed to capture John Brown. His capture was a somber moment for the remaining rebels, who now saw that their brave leader had fallen into the hands of the enemy. The armory, once a symbol of the hope for a new future, became a place of defeat and sorrow. The chaotic battle that began with the promise of a new dawn ended with the sound of retreating footsteps and the echo of loss. As the dust settled and the soldiers secured the area, the news of the raid spread quickly through the region. The violent clash at Harpers Ferry would soon become a symbol, one that sparked outrage in some hearts and fear in others. The simple, honest hopes of John Brown and his followers had been met with overwhelming force, and the price of their bold act was now clear. The capture and trial of John Brown. In the hours that followed the collapse of the raid, John Brown was taken away in chains. The journey from Harpers Ferry to the nearby jail was silent and heavy with regret. The man who had once stood for a simple belief in justice now found himself bound and alone, facing a fate that would be decided in a court of law. The trial of John Brown began soon after his capture. In a small courtroom filled with a mix of curious citizens, local officials, and determined reporters, the atmosphere was tense. The language used was plain and simple, no grand rhetoric, just a clear presentation of the facts. John Brown sat at the defendant's table with a calm dignity that surprised many. His eyes, though tired from the battle, still held a spark of unwavering conviction. During the trial, the evidence was presented in a straightforward manner. Witnesses spoke of the events at Harpers Ferry in simple terms: a sudden attack, a chaotic struggle, and the capture of a man who had dared to challenge a powerful institution. The prosecution painted John Brown as a dangerous fanatic, a man who had used violence to try and upset the natural order. His supporters, however, argued that his actions were born out of a deep desire for justice, a reaction to the cruelty of a nation that allowed slavery to persist. Throughout the trial, John Brown spoke in plain language that everyone could understand. He did not use fancy words or flowery language. Instead, he explained simply why he had taken up arms against what he saw as an evil system. "I cannot sit by while innocent people are tortured and beaten," he said in a firm but gentle voice. "I have seen the suffering of my fellow men, and I cannot remain silent." His words were not meant to incite further violence. They were an honest plea for a better, fairer future. The trial lasted only a few days, and the evidence against him was overwhelming in the eyes of the court. The simple facts of the case, the raid, the violence, the loss of life, could not be ignored by the judges. When the verdict was finally delivered, it was a moment of bitter finality. John Brown was found guilty of treason and other serious charges. As the sentence was read, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Many in the crowd wept quietly, moved by the stark contrast between the man's gentle words and the brutal reality of his actions. John Brown accepted his fate with a steady resolve. Even as the reality of death loomed before him, he maintained that his actions were a necessary stand against the cruelty of slavery. In a final address to those present, he spoke of the hope that his sacrifice would awaken the hearts of a nation and bring about the freedom that had long been denied to many. Chapter 4. The Consequences and Lasting Legacy. John Brown's execution was scheduled for a few weeks after the trial. In the days that followed the verdict, the nation was stirred by news of his fate. The simple story of a man who had fought for freedom, using violence as a last resort, spread from town to town. People on both sides of the debate watched with bated breath as the events unfolded. On the day of his execution, a crowd gathered to witness the final moments of John Brown's life. The atmosphere was heavy with sorrow and a sense of impending change. In a quiet and somber ceremony, John Brown was led to the place of execution. His final moments were marked by a calm dignity, and even as the noose was placed around his neck, he looked out over the crowd with a steady, unwavering gaze. His simple final words echoed through the silence, "I have done my duty, let the light of truth guide you all." John Brown's death did not silence the cause he had championed. Instead, it sparked a fire in the hearts of many who had long suffered under the weight of slavery. His execution became a rallying point for abolitionists and those who believed in the simple truth that every human being deserved freedom and dignity. In homes and small gatherings across the nation, people spoke of John Brown's sacrifice in plain language. They told stories of his courage, of the honest man who had stood up against injustice, even at the cost of his own life. In the days, months, and years that followed, the consequences of the raid on Harpers Ferry and John Brown's trial rippled through the country. For some, his actions were a cautionary tale, a warning of the dangers of extreme measures in the name of freedom. For others, he became a martyr, a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice made in the struggle against a cruel and unjust system. The simple ideals that had guided him from his quiet days on an Ohio farm to the fierce battle at Harpers Ferry continued to inspire a growing movement for abolition. Across the nation, newspapers carried accounts of the raid and the trial in straightforward language. Headlines spoke of a revolutionary martyr and of a man who had dared to challenge the laws of the land. The reaction was mixed. In the South, many denounced his actions as dangerous and irresponsible, fearing that his example might inspire further uprisings. In the North, however, his name soon became a rallying cry for those who believed that slavery was a stain on the nation's soul, a call to rise up and fight for a true and lasting freedom. The political landscape began to shift. The simple, honest truth that every human life was precious and deserving of freedom found new advocates in political leaders and common citizens alike. Debates in town halls and state legislatures turned increasingly toward the issue of slavery. John Brown's legacy, though born of violence and sacrifice, helped to bring the deep divisions of the country into sharper focus. The struggle that had once been seen as a distant issue was now at the center of national attention. As the nation edged closer to the coming Civil War, the memory of John Brown and his raid on Harpers Ferry continued to influence public opinion. Abolitionists used his example to argue that the fight for freedom could not be delayed any longer, that when the voices of the oppressed are silenced, only the courage of one man can light the way. His simple words and the truth of his actions resonated with many who had suffered quietly for too long. In the years that followed, historians, writers, and ordinary people would look back on the events at Harpers Ferry with mixed feelings. Some would remember John Brown as a fanatic who used violence in the name of an extreme cause. Others would see him as a hero, a man who risked everything to fight an injustice that had claimed too many lives. Regardless of the view, it was clear that his actions had set in motion a series of events that would forever change the course of American history. Even today, the legacy of John Brown lives on. In schools and public discussions, his life is remembered as a turning point in the fight against slavery. His story, told in simple language and marked by honest courage, serves as a reminder that true freedom often comes at a heavy price. The violent road he chose, though filled with hardship and loss, was one that forced the nation to confront the deep and painful truths about its own past. In many ways, the consequences of the raid on Harpers Ferry went far beyond the immediate loss of life. It brought the reality of slavery into sharp focus, showing that the struggle for justice was not a matter of gentle persuasion, but one that might require bold, even violent actions. The simple idea that every human being deserves freedom became a rallying point that could not be ignored. John Brown's sacrifice, though it ended his life, ignited a spark that would eventually lead to the great conflict of the Civil War, a war that would decide the fate of slavery and the future of the nation. In the quiet, measured language of his final days, his belief in the simple truth of freedom inspired a movement that grew until it could no longer be contained. His story, from the gentle beginnings on an Ohio farm through the violent struggle in Kansas and the dramatic raid at Harpers Ferry, came to symbolize the high cost of injustice and the hope for a better, fairer world. Thank you for watching our deep dive into the life and legacy of John Brown, from his humble beginnings on an Ohio farm to his daring raid on Harpers Ferry. If his story of courage and sacrifice inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join our community at Stories of Legends. We bring you more incredible tales of historical heroes and revolutionaries told in simple, honest language that makes the past come alive. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Click the bell icon to get notified when our next legendary story drops. Every legend has a story, and every story inspires change. Subscribe now and be a part of our journey into the heart of history.